Well, welcome, welcome. For those of you who have not attended any of our events, this event is being hosted by the Silicon Valley Executive Center at Santa Clara University. This is the second Leading with Love series that we have hosted. Marilyn and I were just chatting before we let everybody into the room about, the need for a shift in business and essentially a lot of professionals sort of crying out for a different way of thinking about business and actually using empathy and forgiveness and things that we often do in our and learn and practice in our personal lives, but actually applying those things in the professional setting. And so we figured building a series around the word love and how that's applicable in the business environment made a lot of sense, and it was very timely. At this time, I want to introduce our partner, and this is the partner that we built the first Leading with Love series with and decided to continue partnering. It was such a great fit for us. Stage 4 Solutions, who is headed by Nidhi Agrawal. So I wanted to give Nidhi a chance to do a quick introduction of herself and Stage 4 as well. So Nidhi, over to you.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, we're really excited to co-host or co-sponsor this webinar series. Like Dennis said, the first series was really well received by our clients. We are a consulting and interim staffing firm, and we work with many leading organizations in Silicon Valley and nationally. And this is definitely a topic that is resonating really well. So we're really happy to partner with Santa Clara on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nidhi. All right. I'm going to ask Aitana before we dive in to go ahead and launch the poll that we've prepared. It's going to give us a little bit of data that we'll use, that Marilyn will use as she talks about leading with humility. So just a few seconds here to answer the poll. All right, so that's helpful. Thank you for doing that for us. At this time, I want to introduce you to Marilyn Gist. We were introduced to Marilyn through a Jesuit network that we created here at Santa Clara for universities across the globe that do executive and professional non-degree education. And as a result, have sort of combined Jesuit networks in the executive ed space and have been able to meet some extraordinary people like Marilyn. And when we read about her background and got the introduction, we knew that she'd be a perfect fit to kick off our Leading with Love series part 2. So Marilyn, we're really happy to have you with us today. Just a little bit about Marilyn. She is the author of The Extraordinary Power of Leader Humility, which is the focus of today, is humility and leadership and why that's so important. Marilyn is an accomplished academician and has extensively studied humility as the essential foundation of healthy organizations, which we focused a lot here in our center on, is building healthy organizations, and has become a thought leader. She is the former associate dean and professor of management and the executive director of the Center for Leadership Formation, and led the design and development of the Seattle University's Leadership EMBA degree program from its inception back in 2006. And so has spent a lot of time in the academic space working with executives around these topics. Prior to that, she was at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and then also later joined the University of Washington, where she held the Boeing Endowed Professorship of Business Management and served as the faculty director of the executive MBA programs there for several years. She has a BA from Howard University and an MBA and PhD from the Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, College Park. So Marilyn, I've taken up too much of your time, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Dennis. It is an honor to be here. I always love working with Santa Clara, and I'm excited to really see this outreach to people who are in the Bay Area. Obviously, one of the hottest and best regions in the country for business and for what's going on. So love to talk with you this morning about some of our findings on leader humility and how that might apply to your work. Before I get going, can we see the results of the poll? And then I'll tell you just a little bit about where we're headed today. Okay, so most people had to create change in how they operate because of the pandemic and are anticipating yet more change as we reintegrate our world. Aitana, can you drop it down to the last two questions a little bit? It looks like you are experiencing some degree, at least 2/3 of you roughly, some degree of conflict or difference of opinion about direction with differing constituent groups that you're working with. And then slightly lower percentage, about 59%, have some racial climate concerns among your staff or your communities. So this gives me a sense of where you're coming from collectively, and I will make tiebacks to a couple of these things as we proceed this morning. A little bit of more background on me. I have a life experience that has kind of keyed me into some issues of humility and dignity, and I didn't know that that's what I was keying into until I began to really work with leaders. And over what has really been 3 decades now of doing leadership development, leadership training, leadership formation work in and outside of higher ed, I've come to recognize that there's some things that we're not talking about. And as Dennis says, they do tie to this idea of love, but I'm coming to that from a particular perspective that may soften it and put it in a behavioral language that most people can get behind. And it's this idea of leader humility and dignity. What I want to do this morning with you is to spend probably about 20 minutes giving you an overview of some key concepts from my work. And then we will have an opportunity to allow you to work into small groups. So Aitana is going to create some breakout groups, and we'll have about 15 minutes, maybe a little more, depending on how the flow goes this morning, for you to address a couple of questions on how this applies to you. And then we'll come back as a full group, maybe get some top line feedback from what happened in your group, what the ideas were that you raised in smaller groups, and then just flow into a general Q&A. So that's the roadmap of where we're going. To get us started, I would like you to just reflect for a moment on kind of the state of our world, on a political scene, when we think about leadership and the challenges we have, and then think also about the organizations that you're working in and the state of leadership there and the challenges that you face. And with that thought in mind, I'd like to pose, kind of a different idea, and it's to ask you to imagine what the world and what your organization would look like if all leaders feel and display a deep regard for other people's dignity. Imagine a world if all leaders feel and display a deep regard for others' dignity. And we could take it a step further and say, imagine the world if all people in or out of leadership feel and display a deep regard for others' dignity. What would the world look like? And I'm going to guess that most of us can imagine that it would be better. On a business level, when we lack leader humility at the top, we're really not often aware of just the opportunity cost from lower employee engagement as people just sort of withdraw their energies, withdraw their enthusiasm, go through the motions, and don't deliver the very best that they could. This is a concept that has implications for leadership everywhere, whether it's government, whether it's business, nonprofits, you name it. And it has implications across non-leadership contexts like family, friendships, communities, and so forth. So I want to spend a little time clarifying what this issue of humility means and just why it is so important. I have a small set of slides, and I'm going to ask Aitana to work with me and maybe pull up the first one. When I began this work, I found that people often confused leader humility with meekness, and it's not what we're talking about. Leaders with humility are confident. They have to have what I call a vital confidence, which is a belief in their ability to lead other people, and a reasonable understanding of their strengths and their weaknesses, and being okay with that, being okay admitting that they don't know everything, but at the same time that they have a set of strengths that really allow them to do the job. So humility is coupled with confidence, but it doesn't stray toward meekness nor arrogance. Arrogance, of course, being kind of a boastfulness, maybe a condescension, a way of trying to elevate yourself while diminishing other people. And there are some leaders, of course, that we've seen who have a style of high arrogance. They don't have humility. So when I'm talking about humility, I define it as a tendency to feel and display this deep regard for others' dignity, the very thing I asked you to imagine at the top of my remarks. And I just want to put it in a context that you can still be humble, and you can be confident, and you can be strong, and you can have high standards. It doesn't require meekness or weakness to have leader humility. Now, let me talk about what dignity means, because humility, by its definition, involves this regard for other people's dignity. So it raises the question, well, what's dignity? And Aitana, if you'll move to the next slide, the first, if you'll just hit that and hold it there, the first part of dignity is what I call the foundation piece. And so if you're looking at any building, whether it's a home, an office building, we don't typically see the foundation, but the structures are not going to be there without a foundation, or it probably won't last very long. The foundation for our dignity as a species is really this idea that life itself is somewhat sacred. And so we have, as a society, a set of laws that show that we value that. We have laws that, make murder inappropriate. We, feel some angst when we hear about suicide. We have debates about right to life versus choice when it comes to abortion. We have debates at the other end of, is it appropriate for someone with a terminal illness to decide to end his or her life? And all of these really wrap around this notion we have that life itself is important, it's special, it's sacred. And so we feel that there is dignity across human beings simply because we're alive. That's the basic. But there's an even bigger part of it. Aitana, if you'll click once more, there is the edifice or the building that we see. And that is a part of dignity that all of us have. And if you could imagine a tall building that has lots of rooms in it, that's kind of an analogy for what our personal dignity is like. And it's made up of experiences we've had in life and feelings that we have about ourselves that derive from those experiences. And other people may not be able to see inside the building and know all of those rooms, but they're still there. So what kinds of feelings? Well, we're each unique. That seems to be another part of the larger mystery of life, is that no two of us is alike. We're different genders, we're different races, nationalities, we have different physical appearances, and we all have feelings about ourselves on that. Most of us have feelings of pride about some of our identity issues. We may also have some things about us that have created awkwardness in our life, and maybe we feel some discomfort or some shame about it. I think of issues of weight, for example, and, struggles I may have had trying to lose that last 10 pounds, and some discomfort I might have about that. But there are a lot of things that go into this building, this edifice of personal dignity that we have. And wherever we have a sense of pride or a sense of discomfort that's significant, those things feed into our dignity. Now, why is this important? So, Aitana, if you would flip to the next slide, what I'm going to suggest is that anytime we think of a new leader in an organization, maybe it's a new boss or somebody who's just hired into a leadership role, or maybe we've just moved into the organization and so we're going to start working with leaders. There's three questions that come to mind, and those are, who are you? You know, beyond your name, I just met you. They told me your name was John Doe, but who are you really? What are you like as a person? And then where are we going? What are you going to ask me to do? Is that going to be difficult? Am I going to have to relearn? Or am I going to have to, work double time or long hours? What are you going to take away favorite projects of mine? So we want to know where we're going. And then, do you see me? Do you see me as an individual who has her own hopes and aspirations and dreams, and certain ways of liking to operate? Do you get that? Or am I just here as kind of a cog in the wheel for you? A more transactional approach where you want me to just do the job and kind of shut up and don't ask any questions and don't talk about it. So those are three questions people have of leaders, and they don't usually ask them out loud. What we do is we observe. And what leaders say and what leaders do provide answers that parallel these questions. So if I'm a leader, after you've interacted with me for a fairly short period of time, you begin to sense who I am. And I'll come back a little later and talk about what dimensions you key into in particular. And after you've worked with me for a short while, you begin to sense from my actions and my words where we're going. And you can sense, from where we're going because of the direction that I'm going to set. And then after working with me for a while, you also notice how I treat you. And that lets you know whether you are seen or whether you're just a cog in the wheel to me. When it comes back to this idea of dignity, the way leaders behave and what leaders say answer those questions. And the answers that matter the most are the ones that really touch on people's dignity. So let me just give you a couple of examples in terms of things that have been in the news relatively recently. We have yet another well-known figure, this time governor of New York, who's facing allegations of misbehavior when it comes to sexual harassment. Right, wrong, or indifferent, a number of women have come forward with this claim, and so that's caused more kerfluffle. Well, what's interesting about this, and it's a recurring theme, right? Next month or month after, it'll be someone else, is that people's dignity is hurt when that comes up. As I explained to a colleague recently, there's probably little that is more personal for us than the choice of who we want to be intimate with and how. And so when somebody else kind of crosses that boundary by imposing through words and actions an intention or an expression, our dignity takes a hit. This is a fundamental issue of dignity, and it's why it becomes so controversial once it finally comes out. We can think of another fairly recent example, which was Joe Biden, who, in talking about the need for us to vaccinate, the need for us to continue to wear masks, made a slip and said we can't afford to have Neanderthal thinking. Well, Fox News jumped on that and they tied it back to Hillary Clinton's comments years ago about deplorables and said, well, now we're deplorable Neanderthals. And what's happening is that the language that's being used is not sensitive to people's dignity. And so it's violating that, it's hurting that, because people feel they're not seen, their dignity is not respected. And so we could look at many, many examples, and I'm picking national leadership only because they tend to be highly visible. Another quick one would be Ted Cruz taking off for Cancun in the middle of a deep freeze in Texas when he's got constituents who don't have water, don't have access to food. They can't take their kids jump on a plane and go where it's warmer. And so the backlash from that also is around people's dignity. Well, we have the same thing happen in business organizations too, when we have people at the top who are not paying attention to how their words and actions are seen throughout the company, or conversely, when they do pay attention and they get it right. And I'll give you some clues before long about how to get it right. Before I do that, let's look at some of the implications. Leading involves relationship. You're not an individual contributor. You are working with and through other people. And this idea of humility, of showing regard for others' dignity, is foundational. It's essential to any healthy relationship. So when you think about who leaders relate to, they have a range of constituents. And if I could have the next slide, Aitana, the first part of that, will just touch on who some of these constituents are, because this, maybe we need to click again to bring up the other side. Thank you. So leaders in business organizations are typically working with not just their employees or their customers, but you also have leader levels above you, typically board members. It could be senior management if you're, perhaps in middle management. You've got a supply chain of vendors and people who may be building or delivering product to you, component parts, or it could be that you've outsourced some of your services. So you have relationships with those vendors. Regulators, almost every business has a set of regulations governing how they operate and their relationships with those people, the geographic communities in which we operate. And so the point is, we have to work together with a lot of different constituent groups, and leaders will have a relationship with each group. Could be good, bad, or indifferent, but the nature of the relationship will really have an impact on how well we work together. And then there are some implications of this. If you'll click one more time, Aitana, I think that title will come up. And those are, what's the health of the organizational culture? I had someone just yesterday talking to me about why is this less common in tech cultures, he was asking. And he was saying, in his experience, some tech cultures, some tech companies have a relatively toxic culture because they don't get this piece. So I'm just mentioning that to say that the implication of whether we regard other people's dignity, personal dignity, well or not, has an implication on the culture. Innovation, where you want people to be more freewheeling, to bring their creative ideas forward, requires a foundation in leader humility. Without that, people are afraid to make mistakes. They're afraid to be put down, made to feel that their idea wasn't any good, or that they were silly for even thinking that or suggesting it. So innovation is affected by leader humility. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. I gave the example of sexual harassment earlier. Certainly on racial levels, we're right now dealing with the issue of Asian hate. How welcoming are we of Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in our culture and in the organization? Is that showing up in positive ways? Same for other ethnic groups. Financial performance. The evidence we have around leader humility is pretty clear that organizations who have leaders who have both strong drive and personal humility are organizations that outperform on a financial level. Reputation, pretty self-explanatory. And then we have some evidence that shows that leaders who are high in humility tend to be higher in average compensation as well. So there are some implications of this. And now one more slide I want to share is, what are the behaviors? What's the magic touch? What do I do to get this right? So Aitana, can you give me the slide? This is what's at the heart of humility. And in the book, I propose this as a model. I call it the 6 keys to leader humility. So you'll see in looking at this that in the middle are those 3 questions I talked about, and the ways in which leaders answer those questions through their own behavior and words. But there are a couple of buckets of behavior that are really important for each question. So when it comes to the who I am piece, my ego. Am I showing confidence without the meekness or the arrogance? That's something that you probably have already, through your own antenna, assessed about me. And it's something you look at with all leaders, consciously or not. Robust integrity. Is the person in charge somebody who walks the talk, someone you can trust and count on? Is their word good? And do they show strong personal integrity? So those are a couple of keys to leader humility around this who I am piece that people really pay attention to, and it influences how much they want to engage. How many of us want to engage with someone we can't trust? Probably not too many of us. If we're in an organization working for a leader who has integrity issues and we need the job, we may stay, but are we really going to give it our best? Or are we going to be looking over our shoulder trying to make sure that we're not harmed? So that's just sort of a part of the humility piece when it comes to who I am. The direction I set is pretty explanatory. I mean, I talk about each of these in the book at length: compelling vision and ethical strategies. Ethical strategies really being, are we asking people to do things that are appropriate, or are they unethical or even illegal? And then some people will find the how I treat you piece to be most important. And there are 2 big sets of behaviors around that. Generous inclusion is one. And we think of inclusion with the diversity, equity, and inclusion discussions, DEI, but I mean it much more broadly than that. So when we think of the list of stakeholders or constituents that I talked about earlier, whether it's your vendors, your customers, your board members, your peer managers, I didn't have up there, but the whole set of stakeholders that leaders interact with is what I mean by generous inclusion. And anytime we're creating a policy or making decisions that can impact those groups, we need to include them. I like to think of it as drawing the boundary broadly enough that all of those groups are on the inside. So how do you do that? Well, it's often not the case that you want to have a meeting and invite all thousands of people to it, but it does mean being mindful of what am I about to do and who is going to be affected by what I'm doing. And particularly if I could see where the effect might be negative or they might have some concern with it, then what we'll want to do is to figuratively pick up the phone and talk to that person. Maybe have a meeting with them and say, we have this issue. We need to make some decisions. I'm going to have to make the call, but I want your input. And then genuinely listen to that. When we go back to some of the questions in the poll where you have some groups at conflict, one of the things I like to do is to bring the groups together, set some broad parameters. Here's our budget constraint, our legal constraint, and here's the issue. And I really want you to come forward with at least 2 proposals that we can choose from. And what that does is put some responsibility on those people who are disagreeing to come up with affirmative, workable answers. And they probably have to collaborate in order to do that, which means they work through some of their disagreement to a point of compromise. But generous inclusion is an important part of how I treat you. I want to give a little vignette here around Satya Nadella of Microsoft, who has really made changes in that culture over the last several years he's been there. And a recent example came up in a webinar I did last week where they were about to make a policy shift, and they needed to choose between option A and option B. 9 people were in favor of option A really strongly. One person was adamantly opposed and was in favor of option B. When they came to the meeting with Satya to discuss it and to make a decision, it might have seemed pretty clear that, well, we've got very strong majority support for option A. Let's just go with it. He didn't do that. What he did was listen to the presentation, and then he turned to the person who was the holdout and asked, what 3 things would need to be true about option A in order for you to support it? What 3 things would need to be true about option A in order for you to support it? And the person, was sort of caught off guard, but had to think and began to talk and began to, make some suggestions. And as those came out, Satya would turn to the group in favor of option A and say, well, what do you think about that? And they would go, well, yeah, I guess we could make this adjustment here to accommodate that. And yeah, we could make an adjustment there. And by the time all 3 of these concerns had been suggested by the option B proponent, he turned back to that person and said, what do you think now of option A? Are you able to support it? And they said, yeah, I can. He turned to the group that had been supporting the original option A and said, can you support it now with these changes? Yeah. So all 10 people had reached consensus on how to move forward. And I just thought that was a wonderful example of generous inclusion, how it would be so easy to just steamroll past the holdout, the one person who wasn't on board, as opposed to working together to come up with an improved solution that really was inclusive and brought everybody on board. Powerful example. And then the final piece is this developmental focus, which is working with people around their long-term aspirations and goals so that they don't feel like they're just a cog in the wheel, but that the leader really shows interest in them as an individual. So that's a quick overview of the model of leader humility. And Aitana, you can take that down for now. So I realize I've been talking for a while, and I want to give you a chance to chew on this material. So we're going to break now into the small groups. We have roughly 15 minutes, and then we'll come back. I'd like each group to think about maybe just one key point you can share when we get back in the whole group.
All right, welcome back. I think we're all back now. Hopefully you had some really good conversation in your breakout rooms, and we wanted to do just a really quick debrief on some of the themes and some of the things that came out of your conversation. So I'll turn it over to Marilyn to facilitate some conversation for us.
Okay, I'm going to assume that with question 1, you each identified all of your stakeholders. And I would invite anyone who had an unusual stakeholder you want us to hear about to point that out as we talk about the other questions. But I'm curious about question 2, how this material applies to you personally. And question 3, how you can enhance your own display of humility through the 6 keys. And I think we're a compact enough group that what I would like is to simply ask you to not be shy, but to just unmute and speak and share your thoughts with the larger group. Anything that came out of your group that you feel is significant on those 2 questions, or on any of the questions, really. So who would like to, since I wasn't in your group, I'm eager to hear. Mike?
Yeah, so thank you. I think that the main thing that came out of our discussion, really in context of the current coming through COVID, hopefully coming out of COVID time period as it relates to subject is that I think we each felt that this is a subject that we take on very personally and believe in, but maybe we had an interruption in our own intentionality around the correct behaviors that would show us as humble leaders and enhancing people's dignity. And each of us talked a little bit about what that meant for ourselves, that introspection and the behaviors that we want to get back to being more fully cognizant of and paying more attention. Other than the one thing that I think everybody just agrees that we got better at was personal empathy, because we're seeing each other in our personal lives as we're all sitting in each other's homes virtually and watching children run by and all those things. Is that's one thing that we gained in terms of our humility as leaders that we want to hold on to. So there's things that we lost during this period and things that we gained.
That's a good observation. Thank you for that. I think, that loads a little bit on kind of seeing, the how I treat you, do you see me piece of, we're seeing each other in our native environment, if you will, a little bit. And I locked my cats out of the office this morning, but, otherwise they would be knocking the book off the table and meowing. But when I'm, working with my students and colleagues, I usually let them roam free, and we're getting used to seeing those kinds of things. What else has come out from your discussion?
I can go.
Yes.
My name is Jane Davorinsky, and on my team, Gina and Thane and I discussed the importance of leaders need to check ego and have a self-awareness when they're leading others. It's important just to recognize whether or not they're getting too hot or if it's very emotional when certain things are going on. It would be good to step back and kind of reassess the situation to understand our own feelings as leaders, and then respond to the situation after we've thought about it carefully. In terms of our audience and our stakeholders, we had a diverse array of groups that we support and serve. Gino serves the board. He has customers. He has his own staff. Thane, he supports Black executives through his the corporate board readiness program. And then myself, I was talking about supporting women on a team that is in an industry that is predominantly for men. And so what we talked about was providing a safe environment without judgment to help our different stakeholder groups feel comfortable communicating with us. And so in that respect, it'd be easier to have that inclusive and generous involvement from everyone if the space is safe. Right.
Good, really good. And I'm curious, what organization are you with, Jane?
I work for, I manage Facebook transportation.
Okay, great. All right. What other insights or, ideas did you come up with from your groups? Nobody else wanting to share?
Well, I'll jump in.
Okay.
I'm a solopreneur business attorney, so my stakeholders are my clients. I don't have an employee at this point. I do a lot of stuff myself, but my sweetheart, who I live with, and I work from home, she's a stakeholder who I have to negotiate with. But I also offered. I used to be a professional musician, and I was principal trombonist in the Jerusalem Symphony. And so I wanted to set the tone for how I wanted our section to play in the music. And music is a particularly collaborative endeavor, especially if you're playing chamber music. Playing in an orchestra, the conductor sets the tone, but even then the good conductors are open to input from the musicians, who also have an enormous amount of understanding of the music and maybe understanding of how a particular passage might work best on their instrument. So it struck me as a an appropriate model for humility to be apparent. I mean, there are some conductors who are autocratic and don't want to listen, but it's not always pleasant to work for them.
Right, right. That's an interesting analogy. And I can see where that has a lot of relevance because an orchestral setting is so collaborative and you have lots of different components, if you want to think of it, almost, divisions of instruments and then the individuals within it. Do you also have, examples within that where you may have a section lead who might have a tendency to over dominate? So hopefully the conductor is able to create more of a comfortable blend for everybody from that. So you have it at multiple levels of leadership within the orchestra itself, but really good idea. Okay. Thank you. And I like bringing in the notion of your sweetheart, as you mentioned it, where we have personal relationships where the humility and dignity is very much in play as well. And we have to look at what that other person's needs are pretty much through the same lens of the 6 keys model that I gave you. Other questions? We can open it up more generally. You can continue to share what you came up with your group, or was there something that came to mind that you would like to ask? We have, a final few minutes for just sort of open Q&A. If there are things that I can answer for you or help you take this back and put it into practice, I'd be happy to do that.
Mike?
Marilyn's Mike. Yeah, so one of the things that I always think about in this subject is that, and I'll use us as an example, in the pocket of a company that I represent, I think that we are very intentional as a group to practice behaviors and try to influence our stakeholders. I think sometimes the members of the team think about other parts of the organization, other stakeholders that may not be as interested in this topic. And the question to you would be guidance on ways to approach others for whom the subject is either a mystery or something that is not something they want to get involved with. What's the best way for us to meet those people with dignity, with empathy, and yet try to influence the organizational culture and behavior?
So I find that the idea of dignity is something that almost everybody can get behind once we think about it. And our culture is not one that does a lot of thinking about it. This is part of what's relatively new about this message of humility, defined as, showing regard for others' dignity. I recently have even been in, a bit of a discussion with somebody who takes significant issue with some of my views on this, and particularly because I'm coming from an inclusive space. And I found that when I approach it by saying, your dignity means a lot to me, but not more than mine and not more than anybody else's, that it causes people to then begin to go, well, yeah, that makes sense. And then I can then introduce this idea that every human being has and needs a sense of self-worth. And it's really helpful in relating if we support that. And again, most people go, yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but I guess it is. And so then you can slowly start to introduce some of the content around what does that mean? What does it take? And this was a case where somebody was challenging me around what I'll call identity politics, and just kind of taking a hardline view that that's wrong, that, it's ruining the country, that we got all these different people who want to be special now. And you can't take that issue head on, but I think you can take that human being as somebody who has, in this case, it was male, has his own dignity. And I can work from there, where we would agree that his dignity matters, and then introduce, but not more than mine and not more than anyone else's. And then you start to get some agreement, and then you can start to work with this idea of what would the world look like if we all supported each other's dignity. So that's really my suggestion in a company context where you've got some believers and some people who don't get it or don't operate that way. And I think keeping the business case at the forefront of what does it cost us if we're not supporting other people's dignity, and it's not a trusting environment, or people withdraw, they're not giving their best interest energy, there's this opportunity cost, it's hitting our productivity. You can begin, I think, to bring people around to it.
Other questions? I know Marilyn and I were also chatting in the breakout room, and we talked about this pandemic period and what it's done to us, in most of our societies, and in regard to forcing us to remember that we're human beings and that we're emotional creatures that think, and not the opposite of that, not the inverse of that. And so this I think this conversation is really timely. I'd love to get your thoughts, Marilyn, on what aspects of the current pandemic environment do you think are going to be lasting as a benefit to society?
I think flexibility in the work from home versus FaceTime in office. I think the needle on that will have moved a lot because we've had an entire year of having to do remote, and businesses have seen that it's possible. It's possible to trust people to get the work done. And they probably learned some things too about how to set direction and look for accountability when you don't have people face to face. It's interesting because there's a mix of whether people want to be back face to face. I'm here in Seattle, and we did the downtown business community, where of course offices have been pretty vacant for the last year, is eager to know, are people coming back? And they had companies survey employees, and surprisingly, the majority of people wanted to come back to work. They want some flexibility. Nobody misses the 2 hours of commuting, but they do miss being in an office with people they, enjoy working with. So they want to come back at least part-time. But what was interesting was the 25% who want to continue to work remote, were many of the lower level employees. And my speculation is that economics is driving that maybe they have to live farther out where housing's less expensive, maybe the commute is longer for them, maybe there's daycare considerations and the cost of that. So the loading on who didn't want to come back was surprisingly heavier on the lower salaried employees. So the implication of this to me is, again, do you see me? And for leaders to really think about what kind of flexibilities do we want to offer people when we start to resume bringing people back to the office. I had a conversation a couple weeks ago with one of the big companies in Seattle, where a woman was saying they hadn't gotten word yet on when they were going to be required to go back to the office. She has a 2-hour round trip commute. And the company has a FaceTime culture. So meaning you need to be there face to face. And so she was saying, I so enjoyed last summer because our weather pattern here means you've got about 4 months of the year where it's really gorgeous and the rest is not so much. And she said, we're forced to be remote, but I was able to get up from my desk and go out for 20 minutes with a walk with my dog when the weather was nice. And I really hope that they will let us continue to work from home over the summer. And then her closing comment was, if they don't, they're going to see a mass exodus. And that was really stunning to me to hear that comment. But it goes back to the do you see me? It goes back to we have also sacrificed a lot for the company for the last year. Can you give us a little bit of grace and let us continue to have this flexibility, at least through the nice weather months here in Seattle, before we have to be all back in the office? And so she said that the top leadership had not made the announcement yet, but they were very much hoping to get at least the extension of flex time through the summer. So I think these are just a couple of examples of this rather tenuous change we are about to make, and the way in which leaders need to really continue to see people and not simply look at, well, for our normal ways of operating and for our business, what do we think is what needs to happen next, and to simply make a mandate that could have backlash that they might not be anticipating. Other questions? Well, I want to thank you for your energy and attention to this, and just offer a couple of final thoughts. One is that leader humility makes a huge difference in terms of the culture of an organization and the results. And it affects results because we do have to work together, and that relationship we have with people is going to have a powerful effect on how well we work together. And then the final thought I would have is that this applies to all relationships. It's not just hierarchical ones, but relationships we have within families, relationships with friends, neighbors, community. It's really all of it. The relationship will not do well if we step all over other people's dignity. And I think of it as kind of a dance between my humility and your dignity. And if you can imagine a ballroom and a partner dance gliding across the floor, if I'm stepping all over your toes and not paying attention to where you are and how you're moving in space, we're going to have a really awkward looking dance, as opposed to if we can flow together. And so this idea of supporting others' dignity doesn't mean we don't have standards and be strong, even in personal relationships. We need boundaries, but we can do it in a way that is, making sure we regard other people's dignity as well. So that's what I have to offer this morning, and I'm going to bounce it back to Dennis and just say thank you. It's been a great opportunity to work with you. I would like to invite all of you to go to my website, www.marilyngist.com, and to please join my community, sign up for the mailing list. I don't spam people a lot, but I do kick out inspirational thoughts now and then, as well as news about upcoming activities. So thank you, Dennis.
Marilyn, thank you so much for giving your time this morning. I think that this topic, like we said in the beginning, is very timely. And I think it's time for leaders across business and outside of business, quite frankly, to upskill and reskill in these ways, and to really think about the people that support the work that these organizations do as human beings. And so that's part of the reason why we're having this conversation. So I appreciate your insight and the great work that you have done with the model. And I encourage everyone to visit the website. I put it in the chat, so you have that. I've also put the LinkedIn profile for Marilyn in the chat earlier, so you can scroll up and click on that and connect with her as well.
Please.
Don't forget, we have 2 more sessions in this series. The next one will be April 8th at 11 a.m. with Jay Jacob. And we're going to be talking about stakeholder value as opposed to shareholder value, and really having the purpose of business be more than just creating profit, but also to find profitable solutions that have benefit to people and the planet. So that's going to be an exciting session that we have. And then following that, we will have our final session in this series on April 22nd with Chris Lowney, who, for those of you who joined us the first series, we're bringing Chris back, and he is going to be talking about what brave people do that cowards can't do in the context of business. So another exciting conversation. So again, Marilyn, thank you so much. Thank you to our partner, Stage 4 Solutions and NITI. And we will see you again in a few weeks. So if you haven't registered, make sure you register for the final 2 sessions in the series. All right, thank you all.